Well, if you wanted, you could do the German, which is, what is it? Herr Professor Dr. Roberts Miller. You could do that.
All right, okay. I thought I just wanted for listeners, I wanted to read off the titles of your most popular posts on your website, patriciarobertsmiller.com. So here, in order, your most popular pieces: What It's Like When You've Been Reading Nuremberg Interrogations, Tapping Hitler's Generals, Shattered Genius, The End, the Wehrmacht Retreats, and Trump administration officials saying they're protecting America by standing by Trump. That's one title. Characteristics of Demagoguery. Number 3, on being nice to Trump supporters. Number 4, advice on writing. Number 5, how to argue about whether something is racist. Number 6, why Republicans shout. And then finally, understanding misunderstandings, how to do a rhetorical analysis. That gives a little bit of flavor, I think, to your wheelhouse. But I want to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself too. So, who are you? What do you do? And where does your work center?
Well, I tell people that my area of expertise is train wrecks and public deliberation. So most people in rhetoric go for moments of inspiration and these wonderful speeches that were done and that really changed things and made things better. But I'm kind of interested in times that people talk themselves into unforced errors. They had all the information that they needed to make a better decision. There were people making those arguments, and they instead chose to do something that they later regretted. So it's not just my thinking that they made a bad decision, but that they regret it. Mm-hmm. Often they regretted it so much that they denied they ever made it. And so that's basically what I've always been interested in and taught about. So that means things like the arguments for slavery, Nazism, racism, segregation, fun stuff. I'm actually a cheerful person, I feel like I need to say.
So your new book, Deliberating War, I pulled out a quote here. I know I'm not the only one. This is at the end of your introduction. You write, if we are in an apocalyptic battle between good and evil, then there is no place for the everyday politics of compromise, deliberation, fairness, and reciprocity. And then you finish that by talking about how hyperbole leads to threat inflation. And then the result of that is democracy itself is one of the casualties of our rhetoric of war. So just 2 comments. One, I'm grateful that you've given us your time because it forces me to spend an hour not doom scrolling like I have been doing for the last 13 days. But then also related to that, I couldn't read over this book and not be thinking about the peculiar political moment that we're in right now, mm-hmm. post Biden's debate disaster. So if you could use kind of the frame in your book to help us think about what everyone's thinking about right now.
Well, great question. And I've been thinking about this since 2003. That's actually when I got really worried about our political situation. And I was writing a book on the arguments for slavery. And it turned out to be much stranger than I thought. There were always political solutions to slavery. Lots of states, I think every colony had slavery, and they got rid of it. So there was always a possibility of politically abolishing slavery. And it was not gradually getting better the way a lot of people want to pretend. In fact, it was getting worse. Slavery was getting more extreme. It was harder to free slaves. There were more and more laws passed about not being able to allow them to have their own religious services, to read, to learn to write. And what really happened, I think, is that a lot of ambitious political figures discovered that slavery was a really hot topic that they could use to fuel their political ambitions. And so they actually created the hobgoblin of abolitionists. Abolitionists were a very small group in, say, 1830, and really created this monstrosity that was involved in an extraordinary, that was a word often used, conspiracy against slaveholders or slavers. And so really it was the rhetoric that created the situation. And what I worried so much about in 2003, as in the buildup to the Iraq invasion, is that people lived in their own enclaves in the same way that they had in the antebellum era, as early as 1830s. They, you would read a Whig paper, and I would read a Van Buren paper, and someone else would read, and those newspapers actually kept promoting the same myths, often about some event that never really happened. And that's what I was seeing in 2003. These people who were living in these worlds that were impervious to disproof, and promoting conspiracies and insist through repetition, as Kenneth Burke says, persuasion is repetition. They were things seemed proven that had never been proven, had just been repeatedly asserted. And so that's when I really started to worry. And what happens when you get that kind of culture, you get the culture of demagoguery first, and then you get a demagogue. They don't create it. They just ride the wave. So I've been waiting for this since 2003. Sorry, welcome to my world.
Well, I mean, I was already in a dark place, and now there's just no light at all. So thank you for that.
I have so many questions about this project, Trish. One of them is that your preceding book, right, on demagoguery, was really well received in the disciplinary space that you and I share. How and so lots of folks that are in our line of work kind of like surfed that wave for a long time. How is this book different from that book? Like what prompted you to sort of write another one, if that makes sense?
Yes.
Not another book, but another kind of treatment of extremism in its rhetorical forms.
Well, that's all but one of my books. So, I mean, my first book was on American Puritans. I'm a fun person. But so one of the things about that book that's really interesting is I have two books on demagoguery. And the first one was, I started writing in 2003 and I finished in 2013 and sent manuscript to the press. And it was rejected because one of the readers said, this is a dead issue. So, and in fact, I had an article published on demagoguery that the reviewers said shouldn't be published. They said it was a dead issue. The editor of that journal went ahead and did it. So then when people got interested in Trump, I was one of few people to have published on demagoguery recently. And so the press, the Experiment, contacted me and asked me to do a little book for a popular audience on the topic. So I did. And that got an academic press interested in the academic version. So what I handed over in 2017, I guess it was the book from 2013. So in fact, our field did not receive my book very well.
Until they did.
Until they did, yeah.
It's funny that you say that about that's not going to be a thing. Paul Johnson at the University of Pittsburgh, he was one of the first people to write about Trump during the right before the primaries, really. And he has a similar, so satisfying story about how an editor was like, "Oh, that's not going to be a thing."
Yeah. But I mean, also what with this book, what I was trying to do with it is the Experiment published two things, speaking of race and demagoguery and democracy, that are very much, they're short. I love it. They're cheap. They're, you can read sitting on a train or something for a short period of time. And but they're very much for a popular audience. And then there was a scholarly book, and I really wanted to do something that split the difference, that had more citations and quotes and things than the popular books did, but was very, wearing my learning light. And was the other thing I really like about this book is it is available in ebook by chapter. So people who are interested in teaching it can have students buy just one chapter rather than a whole book, which I think is, when I was teaching, I very rarely had students read a whole book.
Right.
So that's another way that it's different. Also, in this one, there are, it's a different set of mistakes that people make when deliberating war, and not necessarily demagoguery. So, for instance, one of the chapters is about the Falklands-Malvinas debacle. And what actually happened in that is what's sometimes called decisional avoidance. The British political figures didn't like any of their options in regard to that area. And so they just kept putting off making a decision about it. And so you ended up with a war neither side wanted and neither side thought they were heading into, because they just wouldn't deliberate it. But there wasn't demagoguery, really. It was just avoidance.
Yeah.
It strikes me that, you know, going back to 2003, that one of the things that we're living through now is that the failure to deliberate going into Iraq has created a rise in mistrust of institutions that prepared that kind of prepared a ready-made audience for a demagogue like Donald Trump to take advantage of.
Yes, I think also the creation of this hobgoblin of the liberal, which really goes back to the 90s, and Rush Limbaugh and all sorts of people like that. So a pet peeve of mine, which does not go over well with my colleagues, is I really think that we should need to stop talking about the left versus the right, because it's fairly incoherent. It's a little bit like talking about, I don't know, Christians versus Muslims or something. Well, one, there are lots of other options. In addition, there are things about what kind of Christian you are, or what kind of Muslim you are, that might mean you could work together on all sorts of things. And so it posits demagoguery as our situation by saying we've got this binary or even a continuum. And what really matters is how authoritarian someone is. And you can be an authoritarian centrist. So that's what really, I think, was very disturbing for me, like head banging on the desk disturbing, about that discourse, is the extent to which deliberation was demonized. Sometimes, and I don't use that term without really meaning turned into demonic, or it was deflected or feminized, right? Turned into this weakness. And so here you have a democracy in which people are not supposed to deliberate. And that doesn't work. You know, that's like a business that isn't supposed to sell anything.
Yeah.
That's what democracy is. It's about people disagreeing. And so if you're going to say that people can't verbally disagree, then you're saying democracy can't function. And I think a lot of people who were promoting that didn't want democracy to function.
That's the thing too. Yeah. So here comes a question on that you have heard before. Is there a peril or like a liability, or at what point is there a liability to suspension of what you call the politics of certainty? So the deliberating democracy that you hope for in this book makes certain, I think, humanist, optimistic sort of claims about what people are like. What if they are not like that, right? So if what happens if you are wrong about genuine disagreement and its possible outcomes?
Well, I have to be very careful about what claims I'm making. People disagree. That's just a fact. And I think people disagree largely because of coming from these different enclaves. So when disagreement happens well, people figure out why they disagree. Is it that they had different personal experiences, different information? And then you also have to, for a good disagreement, you have to figure out whether you are open to just hearing the other, if you're open to changing your mind. Those are two different conversations, right?
Yeah.
Or if you just want to throw things. And I think people, and here I'm going back to deliberative folks from like the 80s or something, but I think that if we teach bad methods, if we teach and model bad methods of handling conflict, then every disagreement just explodes because people don't know how to handle it other than trying to dominate the other. Mm-hmm. And so it's not that I think people disagree well. I think people disagree very, very badly. Mm-hmm. And it's because there seems to be just people assume there's only one way to handle conflict, and there are 20.
But does so I wrote rancière in the margin right next to disagreement. And this here's where Jason's eye starts glossing over. Does disagreement, the way that you're hoping it could be conducted, presume that both parties see each other as fully worthy participants?
At least somewhat worthy. Yeah, there has to be respect. And you know, sometimes there isn't for very good reason. Yeah. I remember Wayne Booth talking about how he felt like so I don't know, Jason, if you're familiar with Wayne Booth's work, but just a kind man, really, really kind man. And he talked about how this is toward the end of his life, and he talked about how he thought maybe if he'd been on the planes on 9/11, he could have talked them out of it, which is really sweet. I don't think he could have, but I think, in fact, you know, grabbing those people and crashing the plane was a better choice. So yeah, I think that there are times, but I think also what's happening is people are being trained to be that sort of person who is impervious to disproof and disagreement, and they're getting militarized. I wouldn't say weaponized, I would say militarized. And so every disagreement gets turned into an apocalyptic, you know, battle between good and evil. And it's often done on the part of people who don't have a good argument for what they're trying to do. And so they I think, cynically shift to that. Some people really perceive disagreement that way. They really think that anyone who disagrees with them is spit from the bowels of Satan. And I don't know what you do with them.
When it's pitched as an apocalyptic battle between good and evil in the absence of any sort of eschatological good that it's pointed towards, you know, it's done in the service of the status quo.
Yeah, I think it is, not always, and I think that's how. I mean, that's how people get radicalized. Mm-hmm. Is the first thing is you dehumanize anybody who disagrees with you, anybody not in the in-group. So it's not even just so you take all non-in-group members and they become the out-group. And that's the first step in it. And then a lot of fear-mongering about them. But I've seen that kind of rhetoric all over the place. You know, people who disagree about whether you should feed raw food to your dogs. People who, there are people who will argue that way about anything. And that's just how they see the world. I think also for a lot of people, they just have trouble handling uncertainty. It makes them panic. Mm-hmm. And there's some research that's done on that, on uncertainty making some people identify more strongly with an in-group. And that's how so that's what I mean by personalizing conflict, is that they say, this is a scary situation, so I'm going to, be even more strongly connected to my in-group and loyal to my in-group and fanatical to my in-group, and my in-group will solve this magically.
Can you walk people through your answers to the two questions that you pose in the introduction? One is about framing politics as war, and then the second is if politics is war, what kind of war is it?
Well, so I think politics doesn't need to be war. There are some situations in which I think it is. In which I think it has gotten to that point, right? So I think, for instance, if you're talking about Weimar Germany, particularly after, say, 1932, it was pretty much war. That was what it was. But as I keep saying, I think a lot of times the people who say politics, and sometimes there is a war on a particular person. I think it was perfectly legitimate for Jews, for instance, in Weimar Germany, with the rise of Nazism, to say there's a war on Jews. Mm-hmm. That's just kind of a fact. But I think often and that's a really good case. What the Nazis did is first they posited a war on regular people on the part of Jews, and that is what, proactively or something. I don't know. There's a really weird time thing going on with this. That's what legitimated their then attacking the Jews, as the Jews were about to do it, or they were going to do it, or they were subtly doing it. And that's the sort of rhetoric that you get with a certain kind of politics as war that is really pernicious. And so, and I do think also that the people who make that kind of argument, often it is that they are, they're, as I keep saying, they're incapable of making a good argument. And sometimes it's because that's just how they are. Hitler never made a good argument, but sometimes they don't want to make a reasonable argument. And so for instance, I would say Wallace didn't actually support segregation all that strongly until he had a failed run for president. And then he realized that this was something that he could use. So that's when he started describing the sort of war on the South. So he very cynically was using a war, frame for politics. And then as far as the second one.
So it's like one of the points you're making is it's always been this bad.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, let's start with Alexander the Great. That
was my favorite part where you say, well, I've actually only found one speech that is completely unabashedly pro-conquest.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. I got to anyways, back to your story.
Yeah. Oh, well, so then the second thing as to what kind of war is, I think that, okay, you can have, we can treat a particular issue as war, and it's not disastrous for democracy or for a community. In which case it is limited war. So if you're going to engage in limited war, once we, finish this fight over segregation or something, we can still work together on other issues. But what has happened is that it's absolute war, and absolute war is a war of extermination against the other because they are so evil. So this is a war of extermination, and that's the kind of language that we're hearing. We're hearing it more from Trump and Trump supporters. But I do hear it occasionally from other people who will say, and I think they're not always kidding, that we should just not allow Republicans to vote. That's very few people that I hear, but every once in a while it does pop up, and that's authoritarianism. And I think that's really harmful, regardless of who's saying it.
You're pointing out, so the theologian Stanley Hauerwas, who retired from Duke a few years ago, has written a lot about Christian nonviolence, and his long critique of Augustine's just war theory is that it's never been used. That it's never been used to avoid participating in a war on the part of Christians. And I hadn't thought about until just listening to you just now that to the extent that Christians are engaged in the public square, they should probably apply just war principles to their rhetoric as well, in terms of proportionality, limited goals.
Yeah, it's with the first time you read Augustine on just war, it's like, yeah, right, absolutely. And then you see everybody claiming it's a just war. And like, okay, there's a failure in rhetoric here.
Well,
Yeah,
also,
that's
kind of on that note, or am I interrupting you, Jason?
no, go ahead.
And I don't know if this question makes sense, but I got curious. When you talk about moral license, you describe it, you present that concept as in sort of the exception that people permit themselves under certain circumstances to justify a set of behaviors that would defy them perceiving themselves as good, right?
Yeah.
What happens to that concept, since Jason mentioned Hauerwas, what happens to that concept if the group supposedly is sort of coheres around the idea of not being fundamentally good, but rather being flawed or in need of salvation? Does that work? Does that question fall apart? I'm not really sure, but I wondered.
That's also a great question. Well, and moral licensing is something that social psychologists talk about, and it's and they talk about it in a couple different ways. And one is, I think the experiment was outside of a certain grocery store that you can guess that people often feel good about themselves for going to, and, and how badly they behaved after coming out and and meeting someone who was asking for donations to something. I think that's why it's so terrible to park at that grocery store, because people are jerks.
Oh, that's anyway. Go ahead.
So that's one, is that you do one thing and it makes you feel good about something else, and so you feel like you can be a jerk about something else because you gave $1 to somebody or something. But the other one is sheer membership in a good group means that you hold, and this I only found out about moral licensing 2 or 3 years ago, but I got fascinated by this many years ago, of noticing that people would condemn an out group for something they with themselves were doing, and not have any cognitive dissonance about, you're a bad person because you kick puppies. Let me kick this puppy out of the way. So you get, like, wait, what just happened? And it's because it doesn't, and people call it hypocrisy, but I think that misses how it works, because what matters about it is it's a kind of bad math of my doing that doesn't signify anything about my essential soul, but it does about yours. So, you would think that if people could understand ourselves as flawed and selfish and hurtful, that it would make us a little bit more careful about doing that kind of thing. But there's still the tendency of it's okay if my group does it. It's okay if I do it. I'll park in this red zone just for a minute.
It's like Romans says that we've all fallen short of the glory of God, but that doesn't keep us from measuring distances.
Yeah.
Vis-a-vis our neighbor. Yeah, it's interesting that you're making similar observations to someone like Jonathan Haidt in his book The Righteous Mind, that he's getting at a similar dynamic from a social science perspective. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, I read Haidt, and I thought that book was really interesting and really, really helpful. I do think it's interesting that he starts off with a lot of moral relativism, but his moral relativism ends up turning into a kind of authoritarianism, which is Wayne Booth's argument from long ago, that's what actually happens with moral relativism. And what he says in that book is that in-group loyalty is a good, and he thinks it's just inherently a good. And I just think, do you know about the history of the world?
That's interesting.
Because so many terrible things have happened because of in-group loyalty. And that's one of the ways it manifests is holding the in-group to lower standards than you hold the out-group, while claiming the higher moral ground for the in-group.
And so in-group loyalty keeps us from acknowledging the truth, mistakes, learning from the past. And so at the beginning of your book, you share a story about your uncle and growing up with one particular story of his death, and then learning a different story. Can you share that for people?
Yeah, so he died obviously long before I was born in the North African campaign. He was in the Army Air Corps, and he was just a hero to me. He was just always a hero. And what I discovered when I started reading about it after I was actually teaching a course on pro and anti-war rhetoric, I started to look into it, and I discovered that it was a debacle. It was very, very badly led and badly managed. And I was outraged that somebody would say that. I just had a visceral reaction that it dishonored my uncle to say that his death might have been the consequence of an incompetent leader. And that's, I think, when I realized some reactions some of my students had about talking about, about arguing that we need to deliberate about wars. and the fact that wanting to honor the people who've died and wanting to be honest about failures and mistakes and incompetence feel at odds for people, and they really shouldn't, but they do. And I felt that. I really felt that.
Yeah, that's that's just another line from Stanley Hauerwas that America perpetuates war to honor and justify the wars that we fought.
Yeah, and I think that old Slotkin book makes a really good point too about this, about the arguments in the title, regeneration through violence, of American identity as to some extent being regenerated, reborn, renewed through a war on somebody. And
it sounds more frightening when Dick Cheney says it, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Slotkin's critical. That's one difference.
You look like you have a question.
Yeah, Trish, you mentioned your students, and on a college campus, you kind of encounter all sorts, right? To rehearse the left and right distinction that you critiqued, you meet people from fairly far afield from each other. One of the things that I'm curious about personally in terms of your work is, what has been your experience talking to people who have a little understanding of what you're doing, but a ton of resentment toward it? How do you do that? So you have done all this work on extremism and pretty aggressive political positions. What do you do with their anger toward you?
Well, it always was an advantage that I was teaching electives. And so, a certain kind of student was just not going to take my class. It was fine. But also, I always tried to design my assignments so I wouldn't know the political affiliations of my students. So there were always cultural possibilities or historical possibilities in the assignment prompts, and that I wouldn't know. And so that was also something of just letting them disclose or not. What I did also find is, for instance, in the deliberating war class, I do the same thing in the book. I started with the Peloponnesian War because none of my students would be like, those Athenians, right?
Unless they were Latin students, and then
yeah, maybe, yeah, but then they hated both sides, so it was okay. Yeah, and so so that I could get them to understand rhetoric, because one of the weird things about teaching rhetoric is that you're trying to get people to think about the arguments and how things are framed, and it's really it's very a meta course. And we're not dealing with the issue of whether the Spartans should have gone to war. We're instead talking about what arguments did they find persuasive, why, and so that helped. And then I would slowly move my way up so that the students, by the time we got to the more controversial ones like Vietnam or Iraq, they would understand that this is what we're trying to do. I'm not taking a stand on whether we should have gone to Iraq. I'm taking a stand on how was the deliberation about it. And so that was one thing that sort of helped. In addition, I think that I would point out the most disastrous decisions in Vietnam were made by a Democrat. Mm-hmm. And so to make it clear to students, I didn't see this as a left versus right or a Dems versus Republicans sort of things. I was very critical of Democrats and all sorts of people. In the course on demagoguery, Communist Manifesto was on there, a speech of Stalin's. The interesting question about Stalin and demagoguery is, it was such a boring speech. Is it still demagoguery if it's boring?
That's great. That is such a great. Oh, I love that question so much. Is it still demagoguery if it's boring? That's brilliant, because I have been trying to figure out. Right, we talked recently about this project that I'm working on that really sort of wades knee deep into the language of bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. And I have wondered whether this is not what I'm writing an article about, but I've wondered whether it should be that bureaucracy sort of takes out any spectacle, and when it does, it removes certain topoi, right? It seems like the absence of drama makes certain human rhetorical activities impossible,
Uh-huh.
like apologies or sincerity, really. So it's funny to hear you say, can he be demagoguery if it's boring?
Well, and that how I read an article recently in the Bulwark about that you make a mistake if you don't understand that part of what's going on in one of Trump's 90-minute extemporaneous speeches is there's a levity to it. And he can be a little charming. He can be funny. These odd tangents about boats and sharks and electricity. It's not boring.
I only made it through 1 hour of one of his speeches. I was bored.
Like he can be a bore without being boring.
Yeah, and I think that's a certain kind of I get incoherent when I try to explain this. The best explanation I've heard is agency by proxy. So some people feel like they are powerful because they're fully attached to this person who can be completely irresponsible about something. So the blatherings and the digressions they like because they do that. They don't really understand electricity. And so here's this guy, who's head and he's in that. I think at a influential age, I read Fromm's Escape from Freedom. And it really stuck with me of that a lot of people don't want autonomy. They don't want free choice. They don't want responsibility. And they want the freedom to do things without accountability.
The flesh pots of Egypt. Is the Bible. Yeah.
And then another way to get that is to completely be part of a group so that you are never, it was never you. You were just doing your job. You were just doing what everybody else did. You never chose to do anything. You're just one of them. One of this, not one of us really is not one of them. And the security in that, and part of the security is you are secure from being held accountable.
One of the things I've been thinking about in the last few days, and to kind of couch it in terms of your book, is that this rhetoric of war, political war, can just be a pretense. That you hear in the Democratic Party, for example, a lot of talk about threats to democracy and Trump being an existential threat. And yet, I've read a few stories in the New York Times recently that privately, a lot of Democrats in Congress don't believe that's true. And only, and it's questionable whether they're acting as though they think it's true.
Yeah. I think what is going on, and this is what the political science scholars say, is it's a kind of democracy that he and Project 2025 and stuff want to enact. And it's called competitive authoritarianism. And so you have the trappings of democracy, you have multiple parties, but the structure is such that one party is permanently marginalized. So, for instance, segregated South was competitive authoritarianism for a long time.
Yeah.
There was a Republican Party, but the way that things worked, there was never any chance of their getting into power. But you can look like a democracy, and in a certain sense, it is a kind of democracy, just not very effective one. And so that's pretty openly the goal.
That's Texas, right?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a reason that all the accusations of voter fraud are about Dallas and Houston and Austin, and that's what they keep checking up on and all that. So yeah.
So one of your most recent posts on your website, this is just something that's always driven me crazy, and so if you could shed some scholarly light on it. The title of your talk here is Ambiguous Hyperbole as Rhetorical Strategy. And just as for instance, what drives me crazy is to hear people on the right using the terms communist, fascist, like just any ideology, like just throw them all together and throw them at your opponent, even though they're contradictory. Can you talk about this as a rhetorical strategy?
Give me a minute to pound my head on my desk. And then I will. Yeah, I mean, it's very, very frustrating. And Brad Serber has an article. He's actually talking about pro-gun rhetoric, or gun nut rhetoric, and he calls it howling. And so, and he argues that for some people, there's a certain pleasure in violating the norms openly, and that's what calling the opponent a communist is about. It's demonstrating that they don't care about accuracy, and they don't care about whether it's really, it's true. They'll say things like it's true in a higher sense, or something like that, but they will not. They don't care that it's not right. What they care is it's going to make you mad, and it's going to make other people hate you, and that's all that they're really trying to do. And so there's a certain aspect of bullying in it, really, and it's completely, again, it's stepping out of accountability, because the temptation for somebody is to say that's not communism, and then you're off in some weird tangent, right, about what is communism and whether everybody. And of course, the way that they argue for that is if leftists are all fascists, all Nazis, because Nazis had the word socialist in their title, then Republicans are Stalinists, because the R of USSR was Republic.
Well, and that's actually such a great illustration, right? This is why your book is about deliberation, and what the difference entails between actual skilled reasoning and howling.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And if not, right? So there's a distinction you can make between teaching, for example, teaching students to trace arguments, right? To trace deliberation as it's happening in a speech by the Athenians, or from the 80s and 90s, or what have you, or now. But also to teach, what would it look like, we say to students, what would it look like if you constructed this kind of reasoning? Like if you had to try to make a good argument, crazy as that sounds, how would you hold yourself to the standards that you have just learned? So what if you're not going to say things like the R stands for Republic and thus you are a Stalinist, right? If you're not going to do things like that, what would you discover? And I think that our students, or really anyone trying to figure this out, discovers how time consuming and how much reflection it requires to make good arguments that are actually legitimately following a structure of evidence and claims. But also potentially that it doesn't win, right? I had a really memorable experience a few years ago when I was invited to be a guest judge of a high school debate, where and I remember calling a friend on the way home and being like, so the worst argument won. Like it had no bearing on who won the thing. Like the person who spoke at the end, who wore a suit and was very theatrical, that's the team that won.
Yeah.
So what is your thinking on the merit of deliberation if it isn't materially consequential?
That's the book. I'll give you a weird analogy, but I actually kind of like it. I had this cat once that was not the sharpest cat I'd ever known. And as a kitten, I found him. I was with some friends at a beach, and they were barbecuing. They were grilling salmon, the salmon tuna that they had gotten. And so I went out, and this kitten was eating the tuna that was being grilled.
Like on the grill?
On the grill, yeah. So this was going to end badly, right? But until it ended badly, it was fun, and he was winning. So that's what I would say is, if the way that you're arguing is actually consuming the basis of deliberation, you're going to get a lot of tuna, and then you're going to catch fire.
To keep this analogy going, right? The problem too becomes not just when the cat singes itself, but the cat on fire is going to run into the house and set everything else on fire too.
You're right. Well, and that's also what I'm saying is that, so one of the instances that I talk about is this just bizarre thing. Related to the book about the arguments for slavery. Actually, I will tell you this because I tried to find a debate in, I think I was looking at 1835, 36, congressional record that didn't end up being about slavery. And there were very few. And it was always the pro-slavery side who would relate it to slavery, which I thought was really interesting. But anyway, there were a few, and this was one. And it was somebody calling for going to war against France. And which at this point was absurd. The US had like 10 ships, and France had the best Navy in the world. And so, but it was, it worked out fine. So this guy does this whole speech about we could win and blah, blah, blah. And, we've got democracy on our side. And people went, yeah. Okay, anyway, about this treaty that we should negotiate and how we're going to, so they brought it back. And so what happens, though, when you've got people who are engaged in really irresponsible argument, but that plays well, is you get a kind of escalation of that creates the new norm. And so now you can't have someone who's going to say something like, I don't think Vietnam's really going all that well, without getting accused of being a commie, a pinko, all sorts of things. And because in a certain sense, the public has rewarded poor argument. And so that's now all they're getting. And ultimately, I do put a huge amount of responsibility on the public for rewarding those, those kinds of bad arguments. But they're really pleasurable. They're much more fun.
The problem is the people.
Yeah.
I want to read your thoughts on the boredom of the boring political discourse. That's really intriguing to me. Like when it's not when what would it look like if we stopped expecting entertainment? Various public discourses.
And even simple things. I mean, the number of people that I've thoroughly enraged by just saying, I think there's a good argument for this. I don't agree with it, but I think there's a good argument. And they just can't, it just makes them really furious with me that I'm not really loyal. I'm not really, but I think, I think it's useful. I really upset a class of grad students once by saying, what's a good argument? There was people teaching rhetoric, and what's a good argument for something with which you disagree? And they said, there is no such thing. And I just went, oh no, that's terrible. And I really shouldn't have. But anyway, but I did think that was troubling, right? We're not always right. And even if there's an argument with which I disagree, listening to it, if it's reasonable and it's well made and it's got good evidence, might cause me to at least modify mine, or at least not think that it's the end of the world if they get their way.
It's really, it's good. So I brought this up earlier, but you point out that democracy can be a casualty of this rhetoric without deliberation. You have a lot of historical examples in your book, but what does the future look like when this has become the norm since, for at least the last 20 years?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Civil War is one, right? That's what I started to worry about in 2003. At the time, I thought, well, it's okay because it's not regional, and you need it to be regional really to have a civil war. And the fact that a lot of people in the GOP are openly saying the left is trying to do a civil war. I mean, I actually went through all the times that Rush Limbaugh claimed that there was a war on people like his audience, and it was really common, and accusing the left of wanting a civil war.
So did you just listen to every episode of Rush Limbaugh?
No, I couldn't listen to them. I just read them.
Okay.
Yeah, I just searched for the word war and then read all the the transcripts of all those. No, could not listen to them. But I will say this will irritate a lot of your audience. I think one of the reasons I got so interested in this was being at Berkeley for 11 years and arguing. I'll argue with a parking brake. And so, but arguing with Stalinists. And Berkeley had 4 communist student groups at the time, and who spent all their time fighting with each other and breaking up each other's meetings. And so I just thought that was fascinating, and that's one of the reasons I think that's when I started to think, okay,
and all of them work in Silicon Valley now.
Probably. Well, some had trust funds, but anyway, so that was really, really interesting to me, and it was really interesting, to think about how they were arguing and what it was that what their strategies were, and one of the most important, of course, is don't give any ground, and simply assert. Mm-hmm. And then if a person disagrees with you, you accuse them of being a Trotskyite. If you're talking to Stalinists, a fascist if you're talking to Maoists or whatever it was. So yeah.
My day
libertarians were also jerks too. Yeah. Anyway.
So my day job is as a United Methodist pastor, and one of the things I've had to do for the last few years is help a congregation navigate an ecclesial debate over sexuality. And one of the things that pointed out to me is I think we have so sorted ourselves into like-minded in-groups, and most of that rhetoric is now safely in online or TV spheres, mm-hmm. that people don't really ever have an argument. They're they posture out to the world, but they're never with another person disagreeing over a common topic. And so it made the debate in the church, I think, a lot harder because people don't have that muscle memory of how to have a disagreement.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's interesting because it's often in the interpersonal communication stuff that people have a model for a useful kind of disagreement. And of course, there are lots of different kinds of disagreements. I mean, mm-hmm. There are definitely times when I'll post just a really nasty thing on somebody's page when I get an ad for some group with which I completely disagree. I'm not trying to persuade them, right? But I'm just letting them know I'm here. People like mm-hmm. me are here. Mm-hmm. And maybe somebody else reading the comments is going to be persuaded. That's really different from if I'm having a disagreement with a colleague about whom we should hire. That second disagreement has to be handled in a completely different way.
Yeah.
And I think people don't see, I don't know how to say this. You will know how to say this because you must say this to people all the time. You have to see a future with the other person to have a useful disagreement. Mm-hmm. So, and in say couples or families where they disagree very badly, they forget that they have a future together, and that needs to be an okay future. And so you need to manage this disagreement in a way that you don't set a flaming cat into the house. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That you can do the other things that you need to do together as a congregation. Figure out where the flowers go and what you're going to do for Easter and all that.
Those are harder. Those are harder arguments to have.
That's true, actually. That's true.
And to this point too, what Jason was asking reminded me that an aspect of what you're, like I said, hoping for as you walk through this book, it's happening in the context of a surveillance society,
Hmm.
and that makes what you are advocating for more difficult. So deliberation, if it's an exploration of a topic to see what lines of reasoning are possible, preferable, not, solid, um, then you both parties would have to tolerate the possibility of error. Like, oh shoot, I said X, but I didn't mean it, or like I thought Y, but it turns out I don't actually think that. Never mind. Right? Let's retrace. Let's wind that back in. You can't do that if everything you've ever said out loud or written is on a sort of record that you're constantly being held to, right? And that the penalties are cancel culture. So I think that that's part of the fear of genuine disagreement and deliberation too. That it's what if it gets me canceled?
Yes. Well, I think and there are two steps to that. So um, and the first is that all expressions or beliefs are expressions of identity,
Mm-hmm.
and whether you're in the good group or the bad group, and that's another reason to stop talking about left versus right. Is that there are people in the gay community who argue against gay marriage. They have interesting arguments on it. It's not like everybody who is gay is in favor of marriage for. So I think if we can step back from seeing everything as an expression of identity, I think also we don't acknowledge that people change, and that you believe certain things at a time in your life, or you think certain kinds of jokes are okay, or you don't know what certain words mean. And so everybody's going to have that kind of a record of having said bad things. And I think for some people, even like the thing I said, I think there are good arguments for such and such, they hear me saying, I think those people are good.
Right.
And that's different.
Yeah, very different.
Yeah, and so I think you're right that the fact that this stuff can get held, unless you can be Beyonce and hire people to scrub the web, and we can't, and it's it makes me I feel like there should be reconciliation. There should be, I'm Lutheran, and Lutherans, ELCA, and they have a thing called reconciling in Christ, which I really like that phrase for certain kinds of congregations. It's not saying that we're right and we've always been right. It's that we're going to come together.
Mm-hmm. Well, if I'd known you were Lutheran, I would have started on a whole different track. We'll have to come back to that. Yeah, so I want to respect your time, but do you have any last thoughts about your book that you want folks to hear that maybe we didn't cover?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I hope that it's clear that what I'm saying is I think sometimes it's good to go to war, and I think that it's sometimes the right choice, but it's something that we've got to deliberate and think through and make sure that we're going through the stages and thinking about those stages and what our options are, and just remembering that there are real people that are going to end up dying over this. I mean, that's one thing about war, right? Is people will die. And so that needs to be the final choice that we make. And I think the same thing happens if politics is war. People are going to die. And they don't need to. If there's a possibility of a political solution, then let's find it. The only other thing I would say is that I do feel like the point that is often made of what if we had the Beatitudes instead of the 10 Commandments posted everywhere?
Yeah.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, I was thinking, because I mentioned Hair Loss a couple of times, that he was very formative for me, and yet I couldn't help but I don't know, be admonished, I guess, by the moral clarity of Ukraine's defensive war.
Uh-huh.
That that is a righteous cause, maybe, that is unique, at least in my lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Agreed.
Well, the book is Deliberating War, and people can find you at patriciarobertsmiller.com. So thank you, Trish.
Thank you so much. This has been fun.
Thank you.
And
I appreciate
don't-
the message.
I will press stop.